The crystal glass caught light like a prism, splitting the chandelier's glow into fragments across the white tablecloth, and in that fractured reflection, she saw the barrel first, a dark line that didn't belong among Savannah's finest dining room. Her hand steadied the silver tray she carried, muscle memory keeping champagne flutes from trembling while her pulse hammered against her throat. The mafia boss sat at table 7, the corner position he always requested, his charcoal suit absorbing shadows, while his presence commanded the room without effort. She'd served him twice before, knew he preferred his wine at precisely 60 degrees, that he never touched bread, that his security detail rotated, but his isolation remained constant. Tonight something felt different. The air held weight it shouldn't. Conversations around him seemed scripted, and the man by the bar had checked his watch 4 times in 3 minutes. She moved between tables with practiced grace, her white apron crisp against black fabric, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended badly. The shooter's position revealed itself in angles. Second-floor window across the street, partially obscured by velvet curtains in the private dining area. A sightline that terminated exactly where the boss lifted his fork. Her training had been different, learned in foster homes where reading danger meant survival, where predicting violence kept you breathing. She adjusted her approach, taking the long route past the wine cellar entrance, her shoes silent against Italian marble that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. The tray balanced on her left palm, freeing her right hand to smooth her hair, a gesture that looked nervous, but positioned her body as a potential obstacle. His security noticed her trajectory change. She felt their attention like heat across her shoulders, knew they were calculating threat levels, deciding if a waitress merited concern. The boss himself hadn't looked up, his attention fixed on the man across from him, someone in an expensive suit whose smile never reached his eyes. She reached table 7 as he lifted the fork, veal marsala steaming beneath restaurant lighting that transformed everything into theater. Her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear, each word chosen for brevity and impact, the kind of directness that shattered protocol. "If you look, he'll shoot." The fork fell. It struck porcelain with a sound that seemed to freeze the entire room, a tiny collision that carried disproportionate weight in the careful acoustics of wealth and power. The boss's hand remained suspended where the utensil had been, his expression unchanged except for the infinitesimal tightening around his eyes. The sommelier approached from the wine cellar, his timing unfortunate, carrying a vintage the boss had ordered, before danger materialized in window reflections. He stopped mid-stride, intuition developed through years of reading wealthy clients, telling him something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the room. A woman at table 4 laughed at her companion's joke, the sound cutting through tension like glass breaking, oblivious to the silent negotiation happening 3 tables away. Her diamond bracelet caught candlelight as she gestured, throwing prismatic reflections across the ceiling that danced like celebratory chaos against the underlying stillness. The boss's breathing remained controlled, chest rising and falling with the measured rhythm of someone who'd trained their autonomic responses to obey conscious command. She recognized the discipline in it, the years of conditioning required to maintain such composure when adrenaline demanded flight or fight. His companion's hand had frozen halfway to his water glass, confusion written in the micro-expressions that flickered across his features before being suppressed. Whatever script he'd been following had just been rewritten, improvisation now required in performance, where every word carried consequence beyond its surface meaning. She didn't wait for response, couldn't afford the luxury of confirmation. Her body was already moving, placing the champagne flutes with methodical precision, creating reasons to linger without drawing attention. The man across from him frowned, leaning forward as if concerned, his hand disappearing beneath the table. Through peripheral vision, she tracked the window, watched fabric shift in ways that suggested metal, adjustment, recalculation. The boss's jaw flexed once, a microscopic tell that meant he'd processed her warning, believed it, or at least considered it credible enough not to dismiss. His security detail began subtle repositioning, movements disguised as casual shifts in stance, hands drifting toward concealed weapons with the ease of long practice. The restaurant continued its elegant rhythm, waiters gliding, guests laughing, piano music drifting from the corner where someone played Chopin with technical perfection. She returned to the service station, her back to the room, hands busy with unnecessary tasks that gave her access to the polished copper backsplash. The reflection showed everything, the boss now leaning back instead of forward, his companion's growing confusion, the security closing ranks with practiced efficiency, The smell of seared scallops drifted from the kitchen, mixing with wine and expensive perfume, normalcy persisting despite the violence coiled in shadows. Her manager approached with questions about Table 12, and she answered automatically, her mind calculating distances and trajectories. Time stretched strange, seconds becoming elastic, each heartbeat distinct against her ribs, awareness sharpening to the point where she could hear fabric rustling 3 tables away. The boss's companion stood abruptly, chair scraping marble, his departure too sudden to be coincidence. She watched him leave through the main entrance, watched the boss remain seated with deliberate casualness, watched the window across the street where darkness held secrets. The fork still lay where it had fallen, a small silver casualty of interrupted momentum. The boss's fingers drummed once against the tablecloth, a rhythm that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know how power communicated through gesture. His wine remained untouched, the veal cooling into irrelevance, his attention fixed on middle distance in a way that suggested intense calculation behind manufactured calm. She moved through her section with mechanical precision, refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling, clearing plates from guests who weren't finished, creating movement that justified her presence. Table 9 wanted dessert menus. Table 4 needed more bread. Table 7 needed her to stay alive long enough to see tomorrow. The restaurant's ambient sound wrapped around her like insulation, silver against china, murmured conversations in 3 languages, the soft pop of a cork being extracted from French vintage. Beneath it all ran current she couldn't name, tension that lived in the space between breaths. His security had formed a loose perimeter, positioning that looked casual, but created overlapping fields of coverage. The one near the kitchen entrance met her eyes for half a second. Acknowledgement or warning, she couldn't determine which, through the professional blankness of his expression. She brought sparkling water to Table 8, smiled at the elderly couple celebrating an anniversary, their joy genuine and uncomplicated in ways that felt foreign. The husband held his wife's hand across white linen, their fingers intertwined with the comfort of decades, oblivious to the chess game being played 3 tables over. The kitchen doors swung with rhythmic precision as courses emerged for tables throughout her section. Each plate, a composition of protein and vegetables arranged with the chef's signature style. The normalcy of dinner service persisted, like theater continuing despite backstage crisis, everyone performing assigned roles while aware that something fundamental had shifted. A guest at Table 6 sent back his steak, claiming it was overcooked, despite appearing perfectly medium rare, his complaint feeling like static interference in the evening's careful frequency. She handled the situation with trained diplomacy, her voice soothing while her attention remained divided, processing his dissatisfaction while tracking the boss's security through peripheral awareness. The sommelier finally reached Table 7, presenting the vintage with ceremony that felt absurd given the context, describing terroir and vintage characteristics to a man whose concern lay with survival, rather than grape varietals. The boss accepted the wine with minimal acknowledgement, the ritual completed more from habit than interest. She noticed the piano player had begun repeating songs from earlier in the evening, his repertoire cycling back on itself as if time had become circular. The same Debussy piece that had played during the fork's fall now returned, creating strange symmetry that felt either coincidental or cosmically ironic, soundtrack looping while events spiraled toward resolution she couldn't predict. The boss lifted his wine finally, a movement that seemed to signal something to the men positioned around the room. They relaxed fractionally, though their eyes never stopped scanning, never ceased their methodical assessment of threats both visible and potential. Through the window, Savannah's historic district displayed itself in gaslight and shadow, tourists walking cobblestone streets where Spanish moss hung from oak trees like nature's conspiracy. The building across the street showed no movement now, its windows reflecting street lamps back at the restaurant. A waiter she knew from training dropped a tray in the kitchen, the crash audible even through insulated doors, the sound making 2 security members pivot toward the source before recognizing it as accident rather than attack. Their hypervigilance had infected the space, transforming every unexpected noise into potential threat assessment. The elderly couple from Table 8 departed, the husband helping his wife into her coat with tenderness that spoke of decades together. They walked past the boss's table without awareness, their evening's romance untouched by the violence coiled 3 feet away, existing in parallel universe where danger remained abstract concept rather than immediate presence. She noticed the bartender had positioned himself with clear view of both entrances, his usual casual stance replaced by alertness that suggested either training or instruction. His hand rested near where they kept the phone for emergency services, ready, but not committed, waiting for signals she couldn't interpret. The restaurant's ambient temperature had dropped 2 degrees, the thermostat responding to evening cooling, but the chill felt symbolic rather than meteorological. Guests pulled jackets tighter, ordered hot coffee instead of dessert wine, responding to atmospheric shift they couldn't consciously identify, but sensed in their molecular structure. She wondered if the shooter was still there, waiting with patience born of professional discipline, or if her warning had disrupted plans enough to trigger abort protocols. The not knowing sat heavy in her stomach, mixing with the adrenaline that made her hands want to shake. Her manager appeared at her elbow with concerns about timing, about table turnover, about maintaining the establishment's reputation for impeccable service. She nodded at appropriate moments, her face arranged into expressions of attentiveness, while her awareness remained fixed elsewhere. The boss ordered coffee, his voice carrying the subtle rasp of someone who'd learned English as a second language but mastered it completely. She took the request to the service bar, where steam hissed from the espresso machine, and the barista worked with the focused precision of an artist. When she returned with the demi-tasse, he didn't acknowledge her presence beyond the slight inclination of his head that might have been gratitude or dismissal. His phone lay face down beside his plate, screen dark, but she'd seen it light up 3 times in the last 5 minutes. The security detail's positions had shifted again, creating new angles of coverage, responding to intelligence she couldn't access. One of them spoke into his collar, words too quiet to distinguish, his face betraying nothing of the conversation's content. She collected empty glasses from a nearby table, her movements bringing her close enough to see the boss's hands. No rings, no watch, no adornment except the faint scar that ran across his left knuckles. His nails were immaculate, manicured but not ostentatious, the hands of someone who could sign death warrants and still appear civilized. The piano player transitioned from Chopin to Debussy, the music shifting like the emotional temperature of the room itself, becoming something more contemplative. Guests began requesting checks, the dinner service moving into its final phase, the restaurant preparing for the transition to late-night drinks and dessert. She wondered how long they would wait, how long the standoff could persist under the guise of normalcy, how many people in the room sensed the undercurrent beneath polished surfaces. The elderly couple left with satisfied smiles, the husband tipping generously, their anniversary celebration unmarred by invisible violence. His coffee remained untouched, growing cold in the cup, the cream forming patterns on the surface that reminded her of clouds before storms. The boss's attention had shifted to the entrance, watching each arrival and departure with the focused intensity of someone expecting specific company. Time continued its strange elasticity, minutes feeling like hours. Awareness heightened to the point where she could sense the exact moment his decision crystallized into action. He stood with fluid grace, his security immediately alert, hands moving toward weapons with practiced readiness. The boss's movement triggered calculated response, his security closed formation, creating a human barrier that looked casual, but functioned with military precision, bodies positioned to intercept threats from multiple vectors. He walked toward the restroom corridor, his pace unhurried, each step deliberate in its refusal to suggest urgency. She caught the reflection in the brass wall sconce as he passed, saw his eyes tracking the window across the street, measuring angles that told stories about sightlines and vulnerability. The security detail split, 2 following him into the corridor while 3 remained visible in the main dining area. Her section included tables near the private rooms, giving her legitimate reason to move through the space he'd just vacated. She cleared his table with efficient movements, stacking plates, collecting silverware, her hands performing trained tasks while her mind processed implications. The fork he'd dropped lay beside his napkin, and she palmed it with the smoothness of someone who'd learned sleight of hand from necessity. Metal warmed against her skin, evidence of the moment everything had shifted, though evidence of what remained unclear. Through the copper backsplash, she maintained visual contact with the entrance, watching a couple arrive in evening wear, watching the hostess seat them near the window, watching normalcy persist. The restaurant's rhythm hadn't faltered, hadn't acknowledged the current running beneath polished service. The new arrivals ordered champagne, celebrating promotion or engagement, or simply the luxury of midweek extravagance, their happiness genuine and uncomplicated. She brought their glasses on a tray that felt heavier than physics could explain, the weight of maintaining facade while calculating trajectories adding pounds to simple service. A delivery driver appeared at the service entrance with tomorrow's seafood order. Early arrival disrupting kitchen workflow, his presence creating momentary chaos that pulled attention from the dining room. The head chef's irritation at the timing felt almost refreshing in its mundane authenticity. Normal frustration in an environment where nothing else felt normal. She caught her reflection in the darkened screen of a guest's silenced phone, saw her face arranged in professional pleasantness that masked the calculations running beneath. The disconnect between expression and interior experience felt vast, canyon-wide. The gap between who she appeared to be and who she was becoming in real time through choices made in seconds. The boss's water glass showed condensation patterns that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago, evidence that time was passing despite its elastic quality, that reality continued its forward momentum, even when consciousness wanted to pause and recalibrate. She noted it with the same attention she gave everything, details becoming data in threat assessment she hadn't known she was capable of performing. The boss emerged from the corridor 3 minutes later, his expression unchanged, but something different in the set of his shoulders. His security had reorganized during his absence, one of them now positioned with clear view of the street entrance, another covering the kitchen access. She moved to refill water at table 11, positioning herself where multiple reflective surfaces created overlapping fields of vision. The elderly mirror above the bar showed the front entrance. The polished silver coffee service revealed the corner booth. The window glass reflected the street behind her. The boss returned to his seat, but didn't sit, instead standing behind the chair in a posture that suggested imminent departure. His phone illuminated, screen casting blue light across his features, and she watched his jaw tighten fractionally as he read whatever message had arrived. One of the security detail moved toward the kitchen, his path taking him past her station, close enough that she caught expensive cologne mixing with gun oil. He didn't look at her, but his presence felt deliberate, a message without words about proximity and awareness. She brought fresh bread to table 6, warm rosemary focaccia that filled the air with herbs and comfort, the smell incongruous against the tension she could taste on her tongue. The guests thanked her with the easy gratitude of people whose biggest concern was whether to order tiramisu. The boss's phone rang, the vibration visible even from across the room, but he declined the call with a swipe that suggested irritation or strategy. His wine sat abandoned, the veal completely untouched, evidence of an evening interrupted by calculations that superseded appetite. Through the window, a car pulled to the curb. Black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that signaled either law enforcement or its opposite. The security detail tensed collectively, a wave of readiness that passed through them like electricity through water. She watched the boss's reflection in the window glass as he watched the street, his face revealing nothing but his stillness, revealing everything. The car idled for 30 seconds before pulling away, leaving exhaust and questions in its wake. The hostess seated another couple at table 3, their laughter genuine and unforced. Anniversaries or proposals, or simply the joy of people who existed outside the shadows. She brought them menus and recited specials with smile-trained precision, her voice steady despite pulse hammering. The boss finally sat, but perched on the chair's edge rather than settling back, his posture suggesting coiled readiness rather than relaxation. He gestured to one of his security detail, a minimal movement of fingers that brought the man close enough for whispered conversation. She cleared glassware from table 9, her path taking her within earshot, but they spoke in Italian, rapid syllables that carried urgency even without translation. The security member nodded once, twice, then moved toward the entrance with purpose barely disguised as casualness. The piano player's hands stumbled over a chord, the only break in his technical perfection all evening, and the sound made several guests look up. He recovered smoothly, transitioning into something lighter, but she'd caught the moment his attention had fixed on the window, on whatever he'd seen there. The boss's fingers traced the rim of his water glass, a slow circular motion that she recognized as communication. 3 rotations clockwise, pause, 2 counterclockwise. One of his security detail shifted position immediately, moving toward the bar where he could monitor the street entrance and kitchen access simultaneously. She approached with the dessert cart, its silver wheels gliding soundlessly across marble, tiramisu, and panna cotta arranged like edible architecture. Her path curved deliberately, bringing her between table 7 and the window's sightline, her body creating obstruction that looked coincidental. The couple at table 3 debated chocolate versus fruit, their indecision genuine and sweetly mundane, while she stood positioned exactly where calculations of trajectory and impact suggested maximum interference. The boss's eyes followed her movement, acknowledgement flickering in pupils that caught lamplight like polished stone. His security detail had established a pattern. rotating positions every 90 seconds, creating overlapping coverage that ensured no angle remained unmonitored for more than moments. She tracked their choreography through reflections, through peripheral vision, through the heightened awareness that danger cultivated in those who'd learned to see it coming. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing the sous chef with a question about Table 8's dietary restrictions, his timing placing him directly in the path between her and the boss. She answered while watching shadows shift across the ceiling, cast by headlights from the street below. A waiter she didn't recognize appeared near the wine cellar, his uniform impeccable, but his movements carrying the controlled precision of someone trained beyond hospitality service. He began wiping down an already spotless table, his position creating another barrier in the invisible geometry of protection. The boss lifted his phone, appeared to scroll through messages, but his thumb remained motionless on the screen. Performance rather than engagement. His jawline caught light from the candles, throwing the scar tissue near his ear into sharp relief, old violence written in skin. She moved to clear table 12, stacking dishes with the rhythmic efficiency of muscle memory, her hands steady despite the current of adrenaline that made her want to run. The guests complimented the sea base, asked about tomorrow's brunch menu, their concerns existing in a different universe from hers. Through the brass rail surrounding the service station, she caught fragmented views of the street, pedestrians passing, a couple stopping to photograph the restaurant's facade, a cyclist weaving through evening traffic. Nothing obvious, everything potentially significant. The boss stood again, this time moving toward the window with deliberate slowness, each step a calculation of exposure versus information gathering. His security tensed collectively, hands hovering near concealed weapons, ready to transform from hospitality into violence in seconds. She intercepted him with coffee service, the pot warm in her hands, her approach angled to place her body between him and the glass. Their eyes met for the first time since the fork had fallen, and in that exchange passed understanding that transcended language. She would continue blocking sightlines. He would allow it. He accepted coffee he wouldn't drink, the transaction providing reason for proximity, for her to remain standing where trajectory became complicated. Steam rose between them, carrying the bitter richness of Brazilian dark roast, creating momentary obscurement in the space where clarity meant vulnerability. The security detail adjusted again, one moving to the restroom corridor, another positioning near the hostess stand, creating a web of coverage that appeared random to anyone not trained to see patterns. The restaurant's other guests remained oblivious, their evenings progressing through courses and conversation. A busboy approached with water pitcher, his path carefully orchestrated to provide additional human obstacles between the boss and external threat. The staff had been integrated into security without explicit instruction, their training sufficient to recognize when service became survival strategy. The boss returned to his table, but remained standing, his hand resting on the chair, back in posture that suggested consideration of departure. His phone buzzed again, the vibration audible in the moment between piano notes, and this time he answered with single-word response in Italian that sounded like confirmation. She brought fresh linens to an empty table, her movements creating reasons to maintain presence in the critical zone between window and target. The fabric snapped once as she spread it, the sound sharp enough to make two security members turn, hands moving instinctively before recognition settled. The hostess seated a solo diner near the entrance, a woman in business attire who ordered sparkling water and opened a laptop, her presence either innocent or elaborate cover. The security detail tracked her with the focused attention of professionals who assumed threat until proven otherwise. The boss's companion from earlier returned, the man whose smile never reached his eyes, entering through the main door with hands visible and empty. He approached table 7 with careful casualness, aware of the scrutiny trained upon him, stopping at respectful distance to await invitation. She watched the interaction through the polished surface of a serving tray, saw the boss gesture toward an empty chair, saw the companion sit with the stiffness of someone conscious of being evaluated. Their conversation resumed in voices too low to distinguish, heads bent toward each other in the universal posture of conspiracy or confidence. The window across the street remained dark, its secrets kept behind glass that reflected street lamps back at the restaurant, creating mirror rather than transparency. She wondered if the shooter was gone, or simply patient, if the threat had dissipated, or merely recalculated its approach to changed circumstances. The boss's companion produced an envelope from his jacket, its bulk suggesting documents rather than currency, and slid it across white linen with movements that tried too hard to appear casual. The boss didn't touch it immediately. his attention fixed on the man's face in assessment that stripped away pretense like acid-dissolving paint. She refilled water glasses at table 14, her angle providing clear view of the envelope while appearing focused elsewhere, her training and observation predating her employment by years. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with a watermark she couldn't distinguish from this distance, sealed with red wax that spoke of either tradition or theater. One of the security detail moved closer, his path taking him past the dessert station, where he paused to examine the tiramisu with studied interest that fooled no one. His position allowed him direct line of sight to the envelope, to the companion's hands, to the boss's reactions measured in micro-expressions. The companion spoke urgently now, words tumbling over each other in Italian cadence that carried pleading beneath the professional veneer. His hands gestured, painting pictures in air that meant nothing to observers but clearly carried weight to the boss, whose expression remained carved from marble. She delivered creme brulee to table 9, the caramelized sugar crackling under her spoon in demonstration, the sound oddly violent in the restaurant's cultivated atmosphere. The guests exclaimed with delight, unaware that their pleasure occurred within feet of negotiations that possibly determined who would live to see morning. The boss finally touched the envelope, fingers tracing its edges without opening it, the gesture suggesting he already knew its contents. His companion leaned back with visible relief, though tension remained in the tightness around his mouth, the way his hands wouldn't quite settle on the table. Through the copper backsplash, she caught movement on the street, a figure in dark clothing moving past the window quickly, too quickly for casual pedestrian traffic. Her pulse accelerated, hands freezing momentarily on the dessert plate before training reasserted control, and she continued serving with mechanical precision. The security detail had seen it too, their collective attention sharpening like pack animals sensing predator. Two of them shifted position simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of fire, their movements coordinated through years of working together in situations where hesitation cost lives. The boss stood abruptly, the envelope disappearing into his jacket in motion so smooth it seemed like sleight of hand, there and then gone. His companion remained seated, confusion evident in the way he half rose before settling back, uncertain whether to follow or wait. She moved toward the service station, her path intersecting with one of the security detail, close enough that he spoke without looking at her, words barely audible beneath ambient restaurant noise. Back entrance. Now. The instruction wasn't for her, but she understood its implications. Evacuation protocols being activated, the careful extraction of a high-value target from compromised location. She continued to her station, began preparing a tray with coffee service, hands moving through familiar motions while her mind raced. The boss walked toward the restroom corridor again, his security forming loose escort that appeared casual to untrained eyes. She watched them disappear through the archway, then reappear heading toward the kitchen instead, redirecting through paths designed for exactly this purpose. Her manager intercepted her with questions about Table 6's bill, his concerns about merchant fees, and gratuity percentages absurdly mundane against the backdrop of organized departure. She answered automatically, her attention divided between professional obligations and the unfolding evacuation. The companion sat alone now, his confidence evaporating into nervous energy that manifested in adjusting silverware, checking his phone, looking toward the corridor where the boss had vanished. He signaled for the check, his earlier urgency transformed into desire for escape. She brought his bill with practiced efficiency, accepted his credit card, processed payment through systems that reduced human interaction to numbers and signatures. He left generous tip, perhaps from habit or perhaps from relief, his departure swift once the receipt printed. The security detail's remaining members had consolidated near the bar, their presence obvious now that subtlety no longer served purpose. Other diners began noticing the shift in atmosphere, conversations quieting, attention drawn to the absence of the man who'd commanded the corner table. She walked toward the kitchen, ostensibly to check on an order, her actual path taking her near the service entrance where delivery trucks parked during business hours. The door stood slightly ajar, unusual for evening service when temperature control mattered, revealing slice of alley darkness. One of the security members emerged from the kitchen, blocking her path with body language that communicated prohibition without words. His expression remained professionally neutral, but his hand stayed near his waistband where the unmistakable outline of a weapon pressed against fabric. The boss appeared behind him, his presence in the staff corridor incongruous with his tailored sophistication, like expensive art hung in warehouse space. He looked directly at her, meeting her eyes with intensity that felt like physical contact, acknowledgement or warning or gratitude. She couldn't parse which. His hand moved to his inside pocket, extracted something small that caught light, and extended it toward her across the narrow corridor. A business card, she realized. Heavy stock with embossed lettering she couldn't read from this angle, offered with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to having gestures accepted without question. She accepted the card because refusing felt more dangerous than compliance, her fingers brushing his for half a second, skin contact that transmitted heat despite the brevity. The cardstock felt expensive against her palm, textured in ways that suggested craftsmanship beyond commercial printing, edges sharp enough to cut if pressed with sufficient force. The security detail positioned themselves between the boss and the still-open service door, human shields ready to absorb whatever threat materialized from the alley's darkness. Their hands had moved from hovering near weapons to gripping them, preparedness escalating into readiness that changed the air's molecular structure. She slipped the card into her apron pocket without examining it, the weight settling against her hip like promise or threat, or both simultaneously. The boss nodded once, minimal movement that dismissed her while simultaneously binding her to whatever unspoken agreement the exchange represented. He moved toward the service door, his security flowing around him like water around stone, their formation practiced enough to appear choreographed. She watched them exit into the alley, watched the door close with pneumatic hiss, watched normalcy attempt to reassert itself in their absence. The kitchen staff continued their evening rhythm, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded meters from where they plated duck confit and seared scallops. The sous chef called for more garnish. A line cook cursed dropped tongs. Steam billowed from industrial dishwashers in clouds that smelled of chemicals and heat. She returned to the dining room where her section required attention, where guests expected service unmarred by whatever tensions existed behind polished facades. Table 11 wanted recommendations for after-dinner drinks. Table 9 needed boxes for leftover pasta. Table 7 sat empty with abandoned coffee growing cold. Her manager appeared with concerns about the departed guest's satisfaction, about whether anything had been wrong with the meal. His anxieties focused on Yelp reviews and repeat business. She assured him everything had been fine, the lie smooth from years of practice, her face arranged into expressions of professional concern. The window across the street remained dark, its threat either neutralized or simply waiting, patience being virtue or vice depending on which side of violence you occupied. She cleared table 7 methodically, gathering the untouched veal, the cold coffee, the evidence of an evening interrupted by warnings whispered across white linen. The fork she'd palmed earlier pressed against her hip beside the business card, metal warming to body temperature, 2 objects that represented the moment everything had changed. She wondered if she'd be allowed to keep wondering, or if consequences would arrive with the inevitability of debt collection. A new couple arrived, requested the corner table, and the hostess seated them without hesitation, the restaurant's machinery processing guests, without acknowledgement of what that particular location had witnessed. The wife admired the view, the husband ordered wine, their evening beginning where another's had terminated in strategic withdrawal. She brought them menus, recited specials with smile-trained precision, her body performing trained tasks while her mind remained partially in the alley, wondering where security protocols had transported the boss, whether danger had been real or anticipated, whether her warning had saved a life or merely postponed violence. The piano player transitioned to something lighter, jazz standards that spoke of easier times when danger announced itself in obvious ways, rather than hiding behind business suits and whispered Italian. Guests began requesting their checks, the evening moving into its conclusion, normal service resuming its normal patterns. Her phone buzzed in her locker, inaccessible during service hours, its insistence suggesting multiple messages from people who existed in her other life, the one where she was friend and daughter, and person, rather than witness to crimes she couldn't name. She wondered if that separation could persist, if warning a mafia boss created debt or obligation, or merely opened door to complications she couldn't foresee. The security detail's remaining members departed through the main entrance, their exodus less coordinated now that their principal had extracted safely. They left generous cash on the bar, payment for drinks they hadn't consumed, compensation or hush money, or simply the reflexive generosity of men who dealt in violence and understood its costs. She collected glassware from abandoned tables, her reflection fragmenting across crystal surfaces, multiple versions of herself fractured into pieces that didn't quite align. The woman in the glass looked tired, looked older than 23 had any right to appear, looked like someone who'd crossed invisible lines and couldn't uncross them through wishing. The restaurant prepared for closing, staff beginning breakdown procedures that transformed elegant dining room back into workspace, magic dissolving into industrial efficiency. She counted her tips, processed credit card receipts, performed the administrative tasks that concluded every shift with arithmetic and signatures. Her manager thanked her for professional handling of Table 7, his praise suggesting he'd noticed more than his questions had revealed, his awareness extending beyond merchant fees into the complications of maintaining establishments where power conducted business over veal marsala. She accepted his compliments with appropriate modesty, grateful he didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. The kitchen closed with metallic finality, chefs removing whites that bore the evening's battle scars, line cooks joking about weekend plans in the universal language of people whose work ended when time cards punched. She changed in the staff room, her uniform replaced by jeans and sweater, transformation from server to civilian, completed by removing the apron that held secrets in its pockets. The business card emerged when she hung the apron in her locker, cream cardstock catching fluorescent light, embossed lettering revealing itself in shadows and relief. No name, just a phone number printed in font that suggested European sensibilities, minimalism elevated to art form. She traced the numbers with her fingertip, committing them to memory even as she questioned whether calling would constitute courage or catastrophic error, whether the boss expected contact or had simply acknowledged debt in the only currency men like him understood, access, should she ever need leverage against whatever came next. She walked through Savannah's historic district under street lamps that turned Spanish moss into silver filigree, her footsteps echoing off cobblestones laid before the Civil War. The restaurant receded behind her, its warm glow spilling onto the street like promises that dissolved in darkness, leaving only the weight of the business card against her thigh. Her apartment sat 3 blocks away, above a closed bakery where morning bread smells would wake her in 6 hours, assuming sleep came at all. The key stuck in the lock as always, requiring the specific twist and lift she'd learned through repetition, small intimacy with inanimate objects that constituted home. Inside, her phone displayed 7 missed calls from her roommate, 2 from a number she didn't recognize, and a text message that simply read, "Confirm safe," from an area code that meant nothing to her geography. She deleted the text without responding, uncertain whether confirmation would invite more contact or provide reassurance to someone who shouldn't be concerning themselves with her safety. The business card sat on her kitchen counter, cream against laminate that had seen better decades, expensive beside the coffee maker she'd bought at a thrift store. She made chamomile tea she wouldn't drink, the ritual providing occupation for hands that wanted to shake now that adrenaline was metabolizing into exhaustion. Morning arrived with the bakery's industrial mixers rumbling through floorboards, vibrations that felt like the city waking from dreams into commerce. She dressed for her shift in the same black pants and white shirt, her uniform a second skin that transformed her into function rather than person. The restaurant looked different in daylight, its elegance revealed as careful staging, the magic of evening service exposed as lighting and arrangement. She arrived early, needing the buffer of empty tables before guests arrived with their oblivious demands for sustenance and service. Her manager called her into his office, a converted storage room that smelled of printer toner and old receipts, his expression carrying the weight of conversations he'd rather not have. He asked if she'd noticed anything unusual about Table 7, his phrasing careful enough to suggest he already knew answers to his questions. She replied with professional vagueness, years of foster care having taught her when specificity invited complications, when detail became liability rather than clarity. He seemed satisfied, or perhaps relieved by her discretion, his follow-up questions perfunctory, boxes to check rather than genuine inquiry into what had transpired beneath his establishment's crystal chandeliers. The day shift passed in the mechanical rhythm of lunch service, businessmen ordering grilled salmon, tourists photographing shrimp and grits, her section turning over 3 times before the afternoon lull. She cleared tables while processing the previous evening, replaying the fork falling, the whispered warning, the boss's eyes meeting hers across staff corridor distance. At 3 p.m., a man in maintenance coveralls appeared at the service entrance, requesting access to check the air conditioning system, his credentials appearing legitimate to the manager, who admitted him without hesitation. She watched him through the kitchen's porthole window, noting how his inspection focused more on sight lines than mechanical systems. He departed 20 minutes later with tools he hadn't used, nodding to her in passing with the blank professionalism of someone performing a role. The restaurant's temperature hadn't changed, but she understood with certainty that assessment had occurred, evaluation completed, her involvement in the previous evening's events having triggered scrutiny she couldn't avoid or appeal. Her shift ended at 4, the gap between lunch and dinner service releasing her into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the restaurant's controlled ambiance. She walked toward the river, needing distance from watchful eyes, craving the anonymity that water and tourists provided in equal measure. The card remained in her pocket, its presence constant reminder of connections forged through warning rather than introduction, of debts that flowed in directions she couldn't map. She wondered if the boss had extracted successfully, if the threat had been neutralized or merely postponed, if her intervention had altered trajectories or simply delayed inevitable collision. A text message arrived from the unknown number, 3 words that carried weight beyond their brevity. Dinner. Tonight. Benoit's. The presumption in the message irritated her, the assumption she would comply with summons from stranger who knew her number, despite her never having provided it. She typed refusal, deleted it, typed again, deleted again, the conversation with herself revealing the truth that declining invitation from men who commanded security details rarely ended well for those who declined. Benoit's was upscale even by Savannah standards, the kind of establishment where reservations required weeks of notice unless your name carried sufficient weight to override policy. Her roommate returned home with questions about the previous evening, having heard rumors through the restaurant industry's efficient gossip network about incidents at the luxury establishment where she worked. She deflected with practiced ease, transforming drama into mundane anecdote, erasing significance through careful omission. At 7, she dressed with more care than lunch shifts required, selecting the one dress she owned that approached elegance, dark blue fabric that had cost a week's tips, but warlike investment in future she'd imagined vaguely. Her reflection showed someone older than her years, tired in ways that transcended lack of sleep, but presentable enough for whatever this summons represented. Benoit's occupied a converted mansion where Confederate officers had once planned strategies that failed, its columns speaking of old money and older ghosts. The hostess greeted her with deference that suggested her arrival had been anticipated, expected, prepared for with the efficiency of establishments, where power conducted its business over white tablecloths. She was led to a private dining room on the 2nd floor, its windows overlooking the river, where container ships passed with the patient inevitability of commerce. The boss sat at a table set for 2, his suit different, but his presence unchanged, command existing in posture rather than costume. He stood when she entered, gesture from era when manners mattered, or perhaps from culture where respect was currency in economies of violence and obligation. She sat across from him, noting the security detail positioned discreetly near the door, near the window, creating the invisible perimeter she'd learned to recognize. The wine arrived unbidden, poured by sommelier, who disappeared with the practiced invisibility of those who served power without witnessing it. The boss lifted his glass in toast that required no words, acknowledgement passing between them in gesture older than language, gratitude or threat or simply recognition of what had transpired. He spoke finally, his English carrying the careful precision of someone who'd mastered it through necessity rather than nativity, asking her name with the formality of someone acknowledging they'd conducted business without proper introduction. She provided it, the syllables feeling strange spoken in this context, her identity somehow different when acknowledged by someone whose fork she'd watched fall. The conversation that followed surprised her with its normalcy, questions about her background that felt like genuine curiosity rather than interrogation. His attention focused in ways that suggested actual interest rather than performed engagement. She answered with careful honesty, editing violence and instability from her history, while maintaining enough truth to avoid the brittleness of complete fabrication. Dinner arrived in courses that testified to the chef's skill, each plate a composition of flavor and presentation that transcended mere sustenance. They ate in comfortable silence, occasionally punctuated by observations that revealed the boss's intelligence extended beyond organizational violence into appreciation for art and food and the small graces that made existence bearable. He explained, finally, what had happened after the service door closed, his words painting pictures of extraction through alley systems designed for exactly such purposes, of the shooter found unconscious in the window across the street, of betrayal originating closer than external threat. His companion from dinner, the man with the envelope, had arranged the attempt, motivated by ambitions that exceeded his capability to execute them successfully. She listened while processing implications, understanding that her warning had intercepted not random violence, but calculated removal, coup disguised as assassination, power struggle playing out across restaurant tables and through rifle scopes. The boss watched her face as he spoke, measuring her reactions, evaluating whether she comprehended the full dimensions of what she'd disrupted. The attempted hit had been neutralized with efficiency she didn't want to imagine in detail, the shooter's unconsciousness having preceded, rather than followed, the boss's extraction. His security had been aware, had been testing loyalty within the organization, had used the dinner as stage for revealing conspirators who'd thought themselves clever enough to orchestrate change without consequence. Her warning, he explained, had been unnecessary from tactical perspective, but critical from different dimension. It had revealed her character, demonstrated the instinct to protect rather than exploit, shown him something about her nature that intelligence reports couldn't capture. She felt simultaneously relieved and disturbed by the revelation, unsure whether her irrelevance to his actual safety made her more or less vulnerable. He asked why she'd warned him, his question carrying genuine curiosity beneath its simple construction, and she found herself answering with honesty that surprised her. She'd seen too much violence in her life to allow more when prevention cost nothing but whisper, had learned that standing by while bad things happened corrupted something essential, that complicity through silence damaged in ways that participation didn't. The boss absorbed her answer with the stillness of someone accustomed to weighing words for truth content, his expression revealing nothing but his attention, suggesting he heard more than she'd intended to communicate. He nodded, finally, as if her response had confirmed hypothesis. He'd been testing, validating assessment that had prompted this dinner invitation. He offered her position then, the proposal emerging with the casualness of someone who expected acceptance. Role in his organization that would utilize her observational skills while compensating her beyond anything restaurant service could provide. The offer hung between them like smoke, substantial enough to see but impossible to grasp without committing to its reality. She declined with the same careful honesty that had characterized their conversation, explaining that her life already contained sufficient complications, that crossing from witness to participant would transform her into someone she'd worked years to avoid becoming. His reaction surprised her, respect flickering across features that had remained largely impassive, approval for boundary setting that most people in his world had forgotten how to recognize. He accepted her refusal without argument or pressure, his response suggesting the offer had been genuine rather than strategic, opportunity extended rather than obligation imposed. Instead, he promised protection, discreet, invisible, but absolute, against any fallout from the previous evening's events, insurance that her involvement wouldn't make her target for those seeking to settle scores or eliminate witnesses. She asked what he wanted in return, suspicion born from years of learning that generosity always carried price tags hidden in small print. His answer came with the faint suggestion of smile, the first break in his carefully maintained composure, telling her that debt was already paid, that saving his life, even unnecessarily, had earned equity in economies where currency was measured in obligation and blood. The evening concluded with exchange of phone numbers, his personal line this time rather than the business card's ambiguous access point, connection established through choice rather than necessity. He walked her to the entrance where a car waited, black sedan with driver who maintained the professional invisibility of those who transported power without questioning its destination. She declined the ride, preferring the walk home through streets she knew, needing the transition between worlds that his proximity had blurred. He watched her depart with the same focused attention he'd maintained throughout dinner, security details shadowing her from distance she could sense but not quite identify. Her apartment felt different when she returned, as if occupation had occurred during her absence. Nothing moved, but everything somehow adjusted. The subtle rearrangement of objects on her dresser, the window lock engaged when she distinctly remembered leaving it undone. Evidence of professionals conducting assessment that left no obvious traces. She checked her phone to find a deposit notification, amount sufficient to cover 3 months' rent arriving from account that listed only initials in the transfer description. The money felt like violation and relief simultaneously, generosity that emphasized how thoroughly her privacy had been compromised by involvement in events she'd tried to prevent. Sleep came eventually, exhaustion overriding the low-grade anxiety that had hummed through her system since the fork had fallen. Her dreams populated themselves with fragments, crystal glasses, rifle barrels, the boss's eyes meeting hers across distances that felt both vast and intimate. Conversations conducted in the language of silence and implication. Morning brought the bakery's familiar vibrations, routine reasserting itself with the comfort of repetition. her life resuming patterns that predated her intersection with organized violence. She dressed for her shift, pinned her hair back, transformed herself into the professional mask that customers expected, and tipped accordingly. The restaurant felt normal during setup, morning staff joking about weekend plans while folding napkins into shapes that would last exactly long enough for guests to destroy them. Her manager greeted her without unusual concern, yesterday's interrogation apparently satisfied, his attention already focused on tonight's reservations and the perpetual challenge of balancing ambiance with efficiency. At noon, flowers arrived, 24 white roses in arrangement that spoke of expensive florist, rather than grocery store convenience. No card but the delivery person asking specifically for her by name. She accepted them with professional grace. While colleagues offered knowing smiles and questions about secret admirers, she deflected without answering. The roses sat in the break room, their perfume mixing with coffee and industrial cleaner, beautiful and slightly menacing in their suggestion of attention she hadn't solicited. She recognized them for what they were. Reminder that protection promised was also surveillance maintained, that safety and monitoring existed as two faces of the same careful coin. Her shift proceeded without incident, lunch crowd flowing through tables with the usual mixture of entitlement and courtesy, her section turning over efficiently enough to satisfy management's metrics. At 3 p.m., a regular customer asked if she'd heard about the incident in the building across the street, rumors of police investigation into trespassing, and weapons charges that had dominated local news briefly, before being suppressed through mechanisms she could guess, but not prove. She expressed appropriate surprise, manufactured concern over safety in their historic district, performed the role of uninvolved citizen, while understanding that the shooter's arrest had been arranged with same efficiency that had neutralized the broader threat. Justice was being conducted through channels parallel to legal systems, outcomes predetermined through influence rather than evidence. The afternoon lull gave her time to think, to process the previous 24 hours into narrative she could live with, editing out the parts that felt too heavy to carry, while acknowledging the fundamental truth that her life had shifted in ways she couldn't reverse through wishing. She'd become connected to power through warning whispered across white linen, transformed from witness to participant despite her best efforts to maintain boundaries. 3 weeks passed in the rhythm of normal service, her shifts blending into patterns that suggested nothing had changed. Surface normalcy maintained through her determination to return to life that predated intersection with violence. The roses had wilted and been discarded, their beauty temporary like most things in her experience, leaving only memory of their arrival and the implications they carried. But she noticed the differences when she trained herself to look. The man reading newspaper at the coffee shop across from her apartment, who appeared at different times, but always when she left for work. The car that seemed to follow her route home with coincidental precision. The sense of being watched that felt protective rather than predatory. The boss didn't contact her directly, respecting boundaries she'd established with unusual deference for someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. But his presence persisted in indirect ways, in the security she felt walking home late at night, in problems that resolved themselves before becoming serious, in the apartment application that was approved despite her marginal credit history. She caught glimpses of him occasionally, his car passing on Bull Street, his profile visible through restaurant windows when she walked past establishments where power conducted its business. Their eyes never met during these accidental encounters, both maintaining the fiction of separation, while acknowledging through careful distance that connection persisted beneath surface disconnection. Her roommate moved out to live with boyfriend, leaving her solo in apartment she could suddenly afford despite lack of second income, the mysterious deposits continuing monthly without explanation or demand for acknowledgement. She accepted them as terms of agreement she'd never explicitly made, payment for service rendered or insurance against her speaking about things she'd witnessed. The restaurant promoted her to head server, increased responsibility coming with marginal increase in base pay, but significantly better sections, the kind of advancement that suggested quiet words spoken in management's ear, by someone whose suggestions carried weight beyond their obvious authority. She accepted the promotion with appropriate gratitude, while understanding its true origin. On her day off, she walked to Forsyth Park, needing green space and distance from the historic district's careful preservation of past elegance. Children played on grass while tourists photographed the fountain, normalcy persisting in ways that made her own experience feel surreal, as if she'd imagined the evening that had divided her life into before and after. A man sat down on her bench, close enough to constitute clear intention rather than coincidental selection of public seating. He didn't introduce himself, but his presence carried familiar quality, the controlled awareness of professional security, his position on the bench creating barrier between her and the rest of the park. He spoke without looking at her, words delivered to the middle distance where fountain spray caught afternoon light. The situation had been fully resolved, he explained, internal matters addressed with finality that precluded future complications. Her involvement concluded except for the protection that would continue indefinitely, as acknowledgement of debt that couldn't be repaid but could be honored. She asked if the boss was safe, surprising herself with the question, uncertain when concern for his well-being had become something she carried. The security detail's slight smile suggested he'd anticipated the inquiry, his answer confirming what she'd already suspected. The boss had never been in real danger that evening. The dinner had been trap rather than target, but her warning had revealed information worth more than tactical advantage. He stood without further conversation, departing with the same purposeful efficiency that had characterized his arrival, leaving her alone with fountain sounds and the understanding that some connections transcended their initial formation, that saving someone's life, even unnecessarily, created bonds that persisted regardless of whether you wanted them. Months later, she would catch the boss's eyes across restaurant dining room where he'd returned for business dinner, their gazes meeting for heartbeat, before both looked away with the practiced discipline of people who understood that acknowledgement could be dangerous. But in that brief exchange passed everything that mattered: gratitude, respect, the recognition that they'd each seen something essential in the other during moment when fork fell and silence spoke louder than words. The protection continued, invisible but constant, her life proceeding along paths that felt like her own choices while understanding that someone watched from distance that felt both invasive and comforting. She never called the number he'd given her, never attempted to leverage connection into advantage, allowing the relationship to exist in its strange equilibrium of debt acknowledged, but never demanded. On quiet nights, when restaurant closed, and she walked home through Savannah's historic streets, she sometimes felt presence in the shadows, security maintaining vigil that promised safety without requiring gratitude. She'd learned to recognize the signs, cars that appeared at intersections, footsteps that matched her rhythm from comfortable distance, the sense of being shepherded through darkness by guardian she couldn't see, but knew remained constant. The business card stayed in her jewelry box, cream cardstock growing soft with age but numbers still legible, option she chose not to exercise while taking comfort in its existence. Some connections lived best in potential rather than actuality, in knowing help existed if needed without testing whether promise matched reality. Years would pass before she fully understood what that evening had meant, how whispered warning had intersected with larger forces to alter trajectories in ways that rippled beyond her comprehension. But standing in her apartment looking at city lights, she recognized that some moments divided life into clear before and after, that courage sometimes manifested in smallest gestures, and that silence could carry more meaning than any declaration spoken aloud into spaces where crystal caught light and danger waited in reflections no one else thought to watch. She discovered over time that protection manifested in unexpected ways. The aggressive drunk who'd followed her home suddenly losing interest at her building's entrance, the suspicious package delivered to her door that vanished before authorities arrived, the job opportunities that materialized when her restaurant reduced hours during slow season. Each incident carried the fingerprints of intervention she couldn't prove, but recognized in the pattern of resolution. Her career advanced through merit, but also through invisible hands clearing obstacles, recommendations appearing from sources she'd never contacted, her name surfacing in conversations among restaurateurs who'd never met her. She accepted the advantages while maintaining her integrity, walking the line between earned success and manufactured opportunity, with awareness that both were true simultaneously. The city itself felt different after that evening, as if Savannah had revealed layers she'd previously missed, showing her the infrastructure of power that existed beneath tourist attractions and historic preservation. She began noticing the signals, cars that idled too long, conversations that stopped when she approached, the way certain establishments always had tables available despite being perpetually booked. On her birthday, 3 years later, a bottle of wine appeared at her door, the same vintage the boss had ordered that evening. No card, but the timing too precise to be coincidence. She opened it alone in her apartment, toasting the ghost of connection that persisted in gestures that required no acknowledgement, grateful for protection that asked nothing except that she continue living the life she'd built through her own choices and his invisible architecture. The fork had fallen, and in falling had connected two people across distances that should have been unbridgeable. creating relationship that defied definition, but persisted with the quiet inevitability of debt honored, protection extended, and gratitude that lived in gestures imperceptible to anyone, not trained to see the language of what remained unspoken between those who understood that survive. Al sometimes required trusting strangers with warnings whispered across white linen in moments when looking could have cost everything. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support matters and helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until the next tale finds us in the silence between what's said and what's understood.